High corpse lies hidden in the conservatory's silence. Welcome to Shadow Code, I'm Thornwick. Comment your location. Your voices make every mystery unforgettable. Let's begin. Orchids are supposed to smell like heaven, but that night Wolfe's greenhouse reeked of something closer to hell. The sweet, cloying scent of tropical blooms couldn't mask the metallic tang of blood or the sour stench of fear that seemed to seep from the very walls of the glass sanctuary. I stood in the doorway of the plant rooms, breathing through my mouth and trying to make sense of what I was seeing, while my mind struggled to process the violation of this sacred space. It was past midnight on a Thursday in late September, and the autumn rain drummed against the greenhouse roof like impatient fingers tapping out an irregular rhythm that seemed to match my accelerated heartbeat. The heating system hummed its mechanical lullaby, maintaining the tropical climate that Nero Wolfe's precious orchids demanded. But tonight, the warm, humid air felt oppressive rather than nurturing. It clung to my skin like a guilty secret, making my pajamas stick uncomfortably to my back. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows between the towering benches of plants, creating a maze of light and darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life, transforming familiar shapes into threatening phantoms. At the far end of the middle aisle, crumpled between two benches of Cattleya orchids that Wolfe had been nurturing for the better part of 3 years, lay the body of Dr. Helena Vance. She was a small woman, perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair that had once been arranged in a neat chignon, but now fell in damp strands across her face, like silver threads against pale marble. Her clothes, an expensive wool suit in charcoal grey that I recognized from her previous visits, were soaked with blood that looked black in the artificial light, creating abstract patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of some of the modern art pieces that wealthy clients sometimes tried to pay Wolfe with in lieu of cash. One arm was twisted beneath her body at an impossible angle, and her eyes stared sightlessly at the glass ceiling, where raindrops traced erratic paths down the transparent panels like tears shed by the night itself. The murder weapon lay beside her, a heavy ceramic pot that had once held a prized Paphiopedilum orchid, one of Wolfe's lady slippers that he'd been particularly proud of. The pot was cracked nearly in half, its jagged edges stained with blood and hair, creating a grotesque parody of abstract sculpture. The orchid itself lay scattered across the concrete floor, its exotic petals already beginning to wilt in the recycled air, their vibrant purples and greens fading to brown at the edges, a small death echoing the larger tragedy. My name is Archie Goodwin, and I've seen my share of corpses in my years working as assistant and legman to the famous detective Nero Wolfe. I've discovered bodies in libraries and living rooms, in offices and alleyways, in circumstances both mundane and bizarre. But there was something particularly disturbing about finding a body in this place, this sanctuary of beauty and order that represented everything Wolfe held sacred. It felt like a violation not just of Dr. Vance's life, but of something fundamental about the nature of civilization itself. The greenhouse was Wolfe's temple, his refuge from the ugliness of the world. And now that ugliness had followed him home, I quote, he'd been awakened 20 minutes earlier by the sound of the alarm system. The greenhouse had its own security setup, separate from the rest of the house, installed after a particularly valuable dendrobium had been stolen 3 years ago. When the alarm went off, it meant someone had either broken in or broken something valuable. Since Wolfe's orchid collection was worth more than most people's houses, certainly more than the houses of most of the people who committed the murders we investigated, I'd grabbed my gun and robe and hurried up to the plant rooms on the roof, taking the iron stairs 2 at a time despite the late hour and my general preference for moving at a more civilized pace. The door had been standing open, which was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Wolfe never left the greenhouse unlocked, and certainly never left it open to the night air that could damage his precious plants. The temperature differential alone could shock the more delicate specimens, and the humidity loss could set back months of careful cultivation. But there it was, wide open to the rain and wind, with Dr. Vance's body lying just inside like some grotesque offering to the plant gods Wolfe worshipped. Now I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process the implications of what I was seeing. Dr. Helena Vance was one of the most respected orchid experts in the country, a frequent visitor to our greenhouse, and someone Wolfe had considered both a colleague and a friend. She was also, I realized with growing dread, the last person who should have been in the greenhouse at midnight on a Thursday. Dr. Vance was methodical, professional, someone who scheduled her visits weeks in advance and always arrived precisely on time. The idea that she would break into the greenhouse in the middle of the night was almost as implausible as the idea that someone would murder her here. The sound of footsteps on the iron stairs leading up from the house broke me out of my paralysis. The steps were slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the kind of heavy breathing that indicated considerable effort. Moments later, Nero Wolfe appeared in the doorway beside me, wearing his yellow silk pajamas and a look of profound displeasure that could have curdled milk at 50 paces. At 1/7 of a ton, Wolfe was not a man who moved quickly or climbed stairs willingly, but the security alarm had apparently motivated him to make an exception to his usual policy of leaving physical exertion to others. He paused in the doorway, surveying the scene with the methodical attention he usually reserved for examining a new orchid hybrid. His eyes moved from Dr. Vance's body to the scattered orchid petals, from the broken pot to the open door, cataloguing every detail with the precision of a master detective. He took one look at the scene before us, and his face went completely blank. The expression he wore when his mind was working at maximum capacity, processing information and forming theories at a rate that would have impressed a supercomputer. "Archie," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that indicated he was anything but calm, "call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have a murder in the plant rooms." "Should I?" "Do not touch anything. Do not move anything. Do not even breathe more than necessary until the police arrive." I understood his concern. The plant rooms were Wolfe's private domain, the one place in the world where he felt completely at peace. Having them turned into a crime scene was bad enough. Having them contaminated by well-meaning but clumsy investigators would be almost as devastating as the murder itself. I'd seen Wolfe's reaction when police technicians had trampled through other crime scenes, leaving their fingerprint powder on priceless antiques and their muddy footprints on Persian rugs. But this was different. This was personal. As I headed for the phone in Wolfe's room downstairs, careful not to disturb anything in the greenhouse, I tried to remember everything I could about Dr. Helena Vance. She was a botanist by training, with a PhD from Columbia, and a reputation for groundbreaking research on orchid genetics that had earned her recognition from botanical societies around the world. She'd written several books on the subject and lectured at universities from Tokyo to London, always returning to New York with new techniques and rare specimens that she was eager to share with fellow enthusiasts. More importantly for our purposes, she'd been coming to the greenhouse regularly for the past 5 years, working with Wolfe on various hybridization projects. Their collaboration had been remarkably productive, resulting in several new varieties that had won awards at orchid shows and been featured in botanical journals. Dr. Vance brought the theoretical knowledge and academic credentials, while Wolfe provided the practical experience and intuitive understanding of what made orchids thrive. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared passion, which made her presence in the greenhouse as a corpse all the more shocking. She was also, I recalled as I descended the stairs, involved in some kind of professional dispute with another orchid expert, something about stolen research or plagiarized papers. The details were fuzzy, but I remembered Wolfe mentioning it in passing a few weeks earlier, during one of our evening conversations in his office. Academic disputes, he'd observed at the time, could become quite heated when reputations and careers were at stake. At the time, I'd assumed he was speaking theoretically. Now I wondered if he'd been more prescient than either of us had realized. Inspector Kramer arrived within 20 minutes, along with his usual retinue of detectives, photographers, and technicians. The sight of them trudging up the iron stairs to the greenhouse filled me with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the investigation was officially underway, dread at the thought of what they might do to Wolfe's precious sanctuary in the process of gathering evidence. Kramer looked like a man who'd been roused from bed by unwelcome news, which was exactly what he was. His hair was mussed, his clothes hastily thrown on, and his expression carried the kind of irritation that comes from being awakened by murder at an hour when decent people should be sleeping. "Where's the body?" he asked without preamble, not bothering with the usual social niceties that might have been expected under different circumstances. I led him up to the plant rooms, where Wolfe was standing exactly where I'd left him, still, in his pajamas, staring at Dr. Vance's corpse with the expression of a man contemplating a personal affront. He hadn't moved so much as an inch while I'd been downstairs, maintaining his vigil like a guard protecting something precious, which, in a sense, he was. "Jesus Christ, Wolfe," Kramer muttered as he surveyed the scene, his voice carrying a mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy. "In your orchid collection? What the hell was she doing here at midnight?" "That," Wolfe said coldly, his tone indicating that the question had been occupying his thoughts for the past 20 minutes, "is what we need to determine." Kramer's men went to work with their usual efficiency, photographing everything from multiple angles, dusting for fingerprints, collecting samples of blood and hair. The greenhouse quickly filled with the organized chaos of a major crime scene investigation, and I could see Wolfe growing more agitated with each passing minute. His jaw tightened every time someone brushed against one of his orchids, and he winced visibly when a photographer's flash illuminated a particularly rare specimen that preferred subdued lighting. The invasion was methodical and thorough. Detectives measured distances and angles, technicians collected samples from every surface that might hold evidence, and photographers documented every inch of the crime scene from perspectives that would have impressed a fashion magazine. The greenhouse, normally a place of quiet contemplation, buzzed with activity as the machinery of criminal investigation ground into motion. "Inspector," Wolfe said finally, his patience wearing thin as a technician knocked over a small pot containing a young orchid seedling, "how long will this desecration continue?" "As long as it takes, Wolfe. This is a murder scene now, not a garden party. These plants require precise environmental conditions. Too much disturbance could damage specimens that took years to develop." "Lady's dead, Wolfe. I think that takes priority over your flowers." I could see Wolfe's jaw tighten at the word flowers, a term he considered inadequate to describe the complex, sophisticated organisms he cultivated with such care. Orchids weren't flowers in the way that roses or daisies were flowers. They were evolutionary marvels, intricate biological machines that had adapted to the most challenging environments on Earth. To dismiss them as mere flowers was like calling a Stradivarius violin a wooden box with strings. But he managed to keep his temper in check, understanding that antagonizing Kramer would only prolong the investigation and extend the period of disruption to his plants. The medical examiner arrived. Around 2 in the morning, a thin, precise man named Dr. Vollmer, who'd worked dozens of cases with us over the years. He was the kind of professional who took pride in his work, approaching each corpse with the same methodical attention that Wolfe devoted to his orchids. I'd always appreciated his thoroughness, even when it meant waiting longer for preliminary results. In a business where details could make the difference between solving a case and letting a killer go free. Patience was usually rewarded. Dr. Vollmer spent nearly an hour examining the body, checking for signs of struggle, measuring wounds, taking samples of blood and tissue. He worked with the quiet concentration of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript, occasionally making notes in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. The rest of us waited in respectful silence, understanding that rushing him would only compromise the quality of his findings. Finally, he stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees before approaching Kramer with his preliminary verdict. Multiple, blunt force trauma to the head and neck, he told Kramer in the matter-of-fact tone he used to describe even the most violent deaths. Looks like she was struck at least 3 times with that ceramic pot. First blow probably stunned her. Second, one knocked her down. Third one killed her. Time of death, between 11 and midnight based on body temperature and rigor mortis. But that's just preliminary. Environmental factors in here could affect my calculations. I'll know more after the autopsy. Any sign of sexual assault? No obvious indicators, but I'll check for that too during the post-mortem examination. The clinical nature of the conversation felt strange in the context of the greenhouse, where beauty and life surrounded us on all sides. Here was Dr. Vance, a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding and nurturing living things, reduced to a collection of wounds and measurements. It seemed like a fundamental violation of the natural order, as if death had no business, intruding on a place devoted to growth and renewal. Kramer turned to Wolfe, who had been listening to the medical examiner's report with the same attention he gave to detailed descriptions of new orchid species. When did you last see Dr. Vance? Tuesday afternoon. She came to examine a new Oncidium hybrid I'd been developing, a cross between Oncidium sfacillatum and Oncidium cramerianum that showed promise of combining the best characteristics of both parent plants. She ever come here at night before? Never. Dr. Vance was a serious professional who respected proper procedures. She understood that orchids require consistent environmental conditions and that unnecessary disturbance could damage delicate specimens. She would never have entered the plant rooms without permission, and certainly not at midnight, when her presence could have disrupted the plant's natural cycles. So how'd she get in? Place was locked, right? Wolfe nodded toward a control panel. Near the door, a sophisticated electronic system that monitored temperature, humidity, and security throughout the greenhouse. The greenhouse has its own security system. Electronic locks, motion sensors, temperature monitors. Someone with the access code could have entered without triggering the alarm. Who has the code? Myself, Archie, and Theodore Horstman, my orchid nurseryman. No one else has authorized access. Kramer looked skeptical, the expression of a man who'd heard similar claims before, only to discover that security was rarely as tight as people claimed. No one else? What about Dr. Vance? She was here all the time, right? Wolfe hesitated, and I could see him weighing his response carefully. Dr. Vance may have observed me entering the code on previous occasions. She was quite observant, with the kind of scientific mind that naturally catalogued details and patterns. So she could have let herself in. It's possible, but I could tell from Wolfe's tone that he didn't believe it. Dr. Vance was many things: brilliant, passionate, sometimes argumentative when she felt strongly about a particular theory or technique. But she wasn't the kind of person who would break into someone's greenhouse in the middle of the night, even if she knew the access code. It would have violated everything she believed about professional conduct and respect for other people's property. What about enemies? Kramer continued, moving through his standard list of questions with the efficiency of long practice. Anyone. Who might want to hurt her? Dr. Vance was involved in various professional controversies, Wolfe said carefully, choosing his words with the precision he usually reserved for describing complex hybridization techniques. Academic disputes can become quite heated when careers and reputations are at stake. Heated enough for murder? Apparently so. The investigation continued until nearly dawn, with Kramer's men methodically cataloguing every aspect of the crime scene. They photographed the body from dozens of angles, measured distances between key pieces of evidence, and collected samples of everything that might possibly be relevant to the case. The greenhouse gradually filled with the detritus of investigation, evidence markers, fingerprint powder, photographer's equipment, and the accumulated debris of human activity in a space that was normally kept pristine. They found Dr. Vance's purse in the potting room, a small alcove where Wolfe kept his tools and supplies for repotting and propagating orchids. The purse contained her identification, credit cards, and nearly $300 in cash, more money than most people carried around casually. Robbery, clearly, had not been the motive, which meant the killer had been after something more personal than monetary gain. They also found something more interesting: a small digital camera, expensive and professional grade, hidden in a drainage channel beneath one of the benches. The camera was still warm, suggesting it had been used recently, and its memory card contained dozens of photographs, close-up shots of orchid flowers, detailed images of plant tags and identification labels, even pictures of Wolfe's private research notebooks that he kept locked in a cabinet near his desk in the potting room. "Looks like your friend was doing more than just visiting," Kramer observed, as he scrolled through the images on the camera's display screen, his expression growing more skeptical with each photograph. Wolfe examined the photographs with growing displeasure, his face darkening as he recognized page after page of his private research. "These pictures document my hybridization work. Some of these techniques are proprietary. Trade secrets, if you will. Methods I've developed through years of experimentation and observation. She was stealing your research. It would appear so." But even as Wolfe spoke, I could see doubt in his eyes. Dr. Helena Vance was a respected scientist with a solid reputation and successful career. She had her own research grants, her own laboratory at Columbia University, her own projects that kept her busy from morning until night. Why would she risk everything to steal orchid research, no matter how valuable? It didn't fit with anything we knew about her character or circumstances. As the sun came up and Kramer's team finally finished processing the scene, I found myself thinking about the implications of what we'd discovered. Someone had murdered Dr. Vance in Wolfe's greenhouse, using one of his orchid pots as the weapon. They'd made it look like she'd been caught in the act of industrial espionage, stealing valuable research. But the whole scenario felt wrong somehow. Too neat, too convenient. Like a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces fit together, but the final picture didn't match the image on the box. "Inspector," I said, as Kramer prepared to leave, his men packing up their equipment with the efficiency of a military operation, "what's your theory about how this went down?" "Pretty straightforward, seems to me," he replied, lighting a cigarette, despite Wolfe's obvious disapproval. "Dr. Vance breaks in to steal research, gets caught by someone, tries to run, gets her head bashed in with that pot. Question is, who caught her?" "Could have been a security guard," suggested one of Kramer's detectives, a young man who clearly hadn't been doing this job long enough to develop the healthy skepticism that came with experience. "Or maybe another scientist who was working with Wolfe on a late-night project. Or maybe Wolfe himself," Kramer said, looking meaningfully at our boss with the kind of speculative expression that made my stomach tighten. Wolfe, quote, S-face, darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Hudson River. "Inspector, if you're suggesting that I murdered Dr. Vance, I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm just laying out the possibilities, considering all the angles. You've got to admit the circumstances are suspicious. Murder in your greenhouse, with your pot, of someone who was apparently stealing your research." But I could see that Kramer was indeed considering Wolfe as a suspect, and I couldn't entirely blame him. The murder had taken place in Wolfe's private greenhouse, using one of his orchid pots as a weapon. The victim had apparently been stealing his research, giving him a clear motive. And Wolfe certainly had the physical strength to kill someone. With a ceramic pot, despite his bulk and his general preference for intellectual rather than physical solutions to problems. There was just one problem with the theory. Nero Wolfe never left the house at night. Never. It was one of his absolute rules, as inviolable as his refusal to discuss business during meals, or his insistence on reading for 2 hours every evening before dinner. The idea that he would venture out to the greenhouse at midnight was almost as implausible as the idea that he would commit murder. I'd been working for him for over a decade, and I'd never known him to break that rule, not even during the most urgent cases. But almost isn't the same as impossible, and I could see that Kramer was thinking the same thing. After all, people broke their own rules all the time when the stakes were high enough, and if Wolfe had discovered Dr. Vance stealing his research, if he'd confronted her and things had gotten out of hand, the thought was disturbing enough that I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the practical aspects of the investigation. We had a murder, we had suspects, we had evidence. What we didn't have was a clear understanding of what had really happened in the greenhouse the night before. After the police left, Wolfe and I sat in his office, drinking coffee that Fritz had prepared with his usual attention to detail and trying to make sense of what had happened. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the Persian rug, but the warmth felt hollow after the night's events. It was as if the murder had drained something essential from the house, leaving us surrounded by the same furniture and books and artwork, but somehow diminished. "She wasn't stealing research," Wolfe said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly 10 minutes. "The photographs suggest otherwise. The photographs were planted. Someone wanted us to believe Dr. Vance was engaged in industrial espionage, to cover up the real motive for murder." "Precisely." "So what was the real motive?" Wolfe was quiet. For a long moment, staring out at the street where normal people were beginning their normal days, unaware that murder had visited our rooftop sanctuary just hours before. I watched him think, seeing the familiar signs of his mind working through possibilities and probabilities, testing theories against facts, and discarding those that didn't fit. "Helena Vance discovered something," he said finally. "Something that someone was willing to kill to keep secret. Something about orchids. Something about people who work with orchids." Over the next few hours we began to piece together a clearer picture of Dr. Vance's recent activities. Phone calls to her colleagues at Columbia University revealed that she'd been agitated about something for the past several weeks, though no one seemed to know exactly what was troubling her. She'd been working longer hours than usual, staying in her office until late at night, coming in on weekends to pursue some kind of research that she wouldn't discuss with her graduate students or fellow faculty members. Her research assistant, a young woman named Jennifer Liu, who was working on her doctoral dissertation under Dr. Vance's supervision, was more forthcoming when I reached her at the Columbia University Botany Department. She sounded tired and upset, the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from losing someone you both respected and genuinely liked. Dr. Vance was investigating some kind of fraud, she told me over the phone, her voice carrying the slight accent that suggested English wasn't her first language. She wouldn't tell me the details, said it was too sensitive and that she didn't want to involve students in something that could become a major scandal. But she'd been spending a lot of time going through old research papers, checking citations, verifying data, comparing methodologies across different studies. "What kind of fraud?" I asked, settling back in my chair and pulling out a notepad to record the conversation. "Academic fraud, I think. Plagiarism, falsified research, that sort of thing." She was really upset about it, more upset than I'd ever seen her about anything. She kept saying it was going to destroy someone's reputation when she published her findings, and that she had to be absolutely certain before she went public. Did she mention any names? Any specific researchers she was investigating? No, but she kept talking about orchid genetics research from the 1990s, something about hybridization techniques that weren't what they seemed to be. She'd gotten access to archives from several botanical journals, and she was comparing published papers with original research notes that she'd obtained from various sources. Did she say when she was planning to publish her findings? Soon, I think. She was scheduled to give a presentation at the International Orchid Conference next month in Miami. She said it was going to be a bombshell, that it would change how people thought about academic integrity and botanical research. Did she seem worried about her safety? Did she mention receiving any threats or feeling like someone might want to stop her investigation? Not threats exactly, but she was definitely concerned about the reaction when her research became public. She said some very important people were going to be embarrassed and that their careers might be destroyed. She seemed to feel bad about that, but she also said that scientific integrity was more important than protecting people's feelings. I hung up the phone and relayed the conversation to Wolfe, who was sitting behind his desk, looking like a man contemplating the collapse of civilization. He'd changed from his pajamas into his usual daytime attire: yellow shirt, brown suit, yellow tie, but somehow still looked rumpled and disheveled, as if the events of the night had physically aged him. Academic fraud, he mused, turning the phrase over in his mind like a wine connoisseur examining a vintage of questionable provenance. That would explain the camera and the photographs. How so? If Dr. Vance suspected someone of plagiarizing research, she would need evidence to support her accusations. Photographs of the original work, documentation of the theft, proof that the plagiarized techniques were identical to the originals. But why do it in secret? Why not just ask you for copies of whatever she needed? Because, Wolfe said grimly, the fraud may have involved me. The possibility hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, poisoning the familiar comfort of the office. Nero Wolfe's reputation was built on his integrity as much as his intelligence. He was known not just as a brilliant detective, but as a man of uncompromising honesty, who would rather lose a case than compromise his principles. If someone had used his research without permission, and if that theft had been discovered by Dr. Vance, the implications could be devastating, not just for the plagiarists, but for Wolfe himself. Who would have access to your research? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the gravity of what we were discussing. Anyone who had visited the plant rooms regularly over the past several years. Dr. Vance herself, of course. My nurseryman, Theodore. Various other orchid experts and collectors who had come to see specific specimens or discuss hybridization techniques. Anyone in particular who might have had reason to steal your work? Wolfe considered the question, his massive frame settling deeper into his custom-made chair as he mentally reviewed the parade of visitors who had passed through his greenhouse over the years. There are several possibilities. Dr. Martin Kellner has been struggling to establish himself as an independent researcher after leaving his position at the New York Botanical Garden under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Dr. Sarah Morrison recently published a paper on Cattleya hybridization that contains some techniques very similar to ones I developed for creating temperature-resistant varieties. And then there's Professor James Whitmore. What about Whitmore? He's been claiming credit for developing a new line of miniature Phalaenopsis orchids that have attracted considerable attention from collectors and commercial growers. But I recall working on very similar techniques several years ago, developing methods for inducing dwarfism in normally large species. Similar enough that he could have stolen your work. Similar enough to warrant investigation. We spent the rest of the EC morning making phone calls, trying to track down everyone who had visited the greenhouse in recent months. The list was longer than I'd expected. Orchid enthusiasts are apparently a social bunch, constantly visiting each other's collections and sharing techniques, forming a network of relationships that spanned continents and connected amateur hobbyists with world-renowned experts. But three names kept coming up in conversations: Dr. Martin Kellner, Dr. Sarah Morrison, and Professor James Whitmore. All three were serious researchers with international reputations. All three had published significant papers in the past year, and all three had been frequent visitors to Wolfe's plant rooms, spending hours examining his specimens and discussing his methods. By afternoon, we had arranged to meet with each of them. The process required considerable diplomatic skill. None of them wanted to be questioned about a murder investigation, and all of them seemed to understand that being associated with the case could damage their professional reputations. But the promise of information about Dr. Vance's death, combined with subtle suggestions that cooperation would be appreciated while obstruction would be remembered, eventually secured their agreement to meet. Dr. Kellner agreed to come to the house immediately, claiming that his afternoon was free and that he was eager to help with the investigation. Dr. Morrison said she could stop by after her classes ended at Columbia, though she insisted that she could only spare an hour and would need to leave by 6 o'clock for a dinner engagement. Professor Whitmore was more evasive, claiming he was busy with grant applications and committee meetings, but finally agreed to meet us for dinner at his club, a venue that would provide both privacy and the kind of formal atmosphere he seemed to prefer. Dr. Martin Kellner arrived at 4 o'clock, a tall, thin man in his 40s with nervous eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He had the kind of restless energy that suggested either exceptional enthusiasm or considerable anxiety, and I found myself wondering which emotion was driving his fidgeting. He'd heard about Dr. Vance's murder on the news and was visibly shaken by it, though whether from grief or fear remained to be determined. Helena was a good friend, he said, as he settled into the red leather chair in Wolfe's office, his hands continuing their nervous dance as he spoke. We disagreed about research methods sometimes. She was more conservative, more traditional in her approach, while I tend to be more experimental. But she was always fair, always honest in her assessments of other people's work. "When did you last see her?" Wolfe asked, leaning back in his chair and studying Kellner with the attention he usually reserved for examining a new orchid species. "About 2 weeks ago, at the New York Orchid Society meeting at the Natural History Museum. We had a brief conversation after the main presentation, something about new developments in tissue culture techniques. She seemed upset about something, distracted, but when I asked what was bothering her, she said she couldn't talk about it yet." "Did she mention any specific concerns about academic fraud or plagiarism?" Kellner's hands stopped moving for a moment, freezing in mid-gesture like a photograph capturing an instant of surprise. "Fraud? What kind of fraud?" "Plagiarism, stolen research, the appropriation of other people's work without proper attribution or permission." "No, she never mentioned anything like that to me. Helena was always very careful about citations and references. She believed strongly in giving credit where credit was due." But I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the coolness of the afternoon and the efficient air conditioning in Wolfe's office. His nervous energy seemed to have shifted into a higher gear, his hands resuming their movement, but with a more agitated quality that suggested increasing anxiety. "Dr. Kellner," I said, leaning forward in my chair and adopting the kind of conversational tone that encouraged confidence, "we understand you've published several significant papers recently." "Yes, 3 in the past year. Breakthrough work on orchid genetics, particularly in the area of induced polyploidy for creating larger flowers and more vigorous plants. Breakthrough work that Dr. Vance may have been investigating." "I don't know." "What you mean?" Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his massive bulk intimidating even when he was sitting down. The movement was subtle but effective, creating the impression that he was focusing his full attention on Kellner, which in fact he was. Dr. Kellner. Helena Vance was murdered while apparently investigating academic fraud involving orchid research. We have reason to believe she had discovered evidence of plagiarism, systematic theft of proprietary techniques and methods. If you know anything about this, now would be an appropriate time to share that information. Kellner sat in silence for nearly a minute, his hands continuing their nervous fidgeting while his mind apparently wrestled with the decision of how much to reveal. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled only by the ticking of the antique clock on Wolfe's desk and the distant sounds of traffic on the street outside. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Helena came to see me 3 weeks ago. She said she'd been reviewing research papers from the past decade, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, similarities that might indicate improper appropriation of ideas. She'd found some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Techniques that appeared in multiple papers by different authors, published months or years apart. Research methodologies that seemed to have been copied from unpublished sources, with minor variations to disguise the theft. Such as your work, Mr. Wolfe. She said several researchers had published papers that contained techniques identical to ones you'd developed, but never formally published. Methods that you'd shared in private conversations or demonstrated during visits to your greenhouse. Wolfe's expression grew even more grim, if such a thing were possible. Including yourself? Kellner nodded miserably. My paper on temperature-controlled hybridization, the core methodology came from conversations I'd had with you here in your greenhouse during my visits last spring. I should have cited you as a source, should have acknowledged that the techniques weren't entirely my own development. But the paper was already late, and my department was pressuring me to publish. I thought no one would notice the similarities. But Dr. Vance noticed. She noticed everything. Helena had an almost photographic memory for research methodologies, and she'd been systematically reviewing papers published in the major botanical journals over the past decade. She was putting together a comprehensive report on academic fraud in orchid research, documenting cases of plagiarism and improper appropriation of ideas. Who else was involved in this network of appropriation? I don't know all the names, but she mentioned Dr. Morrison and Professor Whitmore specifically. She said there were others too, researchers from different countries who had been publishing work that seemed suspiciously similar to unpublished techniques they couldn't have, developed independently. What did she plan to do with this information? Present it at the International Orchid Conference next month in Miami. She said it was going to be the biggest scandal in botanical research since the Piltdown Man hoax, that it would force the entire scientific community to re-examine how research was conducted and published. And how did you respond to her accusations? Kellner's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a child caught stealing cookies from the jar. I begged her not to publish my name. I told her about the pressure I was under, about how losing my reputation would mean losing everything I'd worked for. I offered to make a public acknowledgement, to correct the record and give you proper credit. Did she agree to that? She said she'd consider it, but that any arrangement would have to include all the other researchers involved. She wasn't interested in making deals with individuals. She wanted comprehensive reform of how botanical research was conducted and published. After Kellner left, looking like a man reprieved from execution, but still facing an uncertain future, Wolfe sat in thoughtful silence. I could see him processing the implications of what we'd learned, weighing the information against his own knowledge of the academic world and the pressures that drove researchers to compromise their integrity. So Dr. Vance was planning to expose a plagiarism ring, I said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. A plagiarism ring that included some of the most respected names in orchid research, Wolfe replied, his voice carrying a note of profound disappointment. People who should have known better, who had built their careers on the foundation of scientific integrity, respected enough to kill for their reputations. Academic careers are built on reputation, Archie. Destroy a scientist's credibility, and you destroy their life's work, their legacy, their ability to continue contributing to their field. For someone who had devoted their entire adult life to research, such destruction might indeed seem worth killing to prevent. Seems like a pretty good motive for murder. Indeed, but the question remains, which of our suspects was desperate enough to resort to violence? Dr. Sarah Morrison arrived at 6 o'clock, precisely on time, as promised. A handsome woman in her 50s with prematurely grey hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. She was dressed professionally but not ostentatiously, in a dark blue suit that suggested success without flaunting it. She settled into the chair that Dr. Kellner had vacated and looked at us with barely concealed impatience. "I can't stay long," she said, glancing at her watch with the kind of pointed gesture that indicated she had more important things to do than discuss murder with a private detective and his assistant. "I have dinner plans with the dean of the graduate school, and it wouldn't be appropriate to keep him waiting." "Dr. Morrison," Wolfe began, settling back in his chair and adopting the patient tone he used when dealing with reluctant witnesses, "what can you tell us about Dr. Vance's research into academic fraud?" If she was surprised by the directness of the question, she didn't show it. Her expression remained professionally neutral, the kind of controlled blankness that academics perfected after years of faculty meetings and academic politics. Helena was always concerned about proper attribution in scientific research. It was something of a crusade for her, ensuring that credit was given where credit was due. A crusade that may have led to her murder. "That's a serious accusation. Mr. Wolfe." "It's a serious situation, Dr. Morrison. Dr. Vance was apparently investigating plagiarism involving orchid research, systematic theft of proprietary techniques and methodologies. We believe she had uncovered evidence that several prominent researchers had appropriated unpublished work without permission or acknowledgement." Dr. Morrison's composure cracked slightly, a brief flicker of concern crossing her features before she regained control. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that could destroy careers," I said, leaning forward in my chair and studying her reaction carefully. "The kind that someone might kill to suppress." She was quiet for a moment, studying, her hands with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was carefully considering her next words. When she looked up, her expression had changed from confident to calculating, as if she were reassessing the situation and determining how much information she needed to reveal. "Helena came to see me last month," she admitted, her voice carrying a note of reluctant honesty. "She said she'd been reviewing recent publications in botanical journals, looking for patterns and similarities that might indicate improper appropriation of research." "And what did she find?" "She said she'd found similarities between my recent paper on Cattleya hybridization and some unpublished research she'd discovered in various archives and private collections. Unpublished research that originated where? Here, in your greenhouse, Mr. Wolfe. She claimed that I'd appropriated techniques you'd developed without giving proper credit, that my methodology section contained descriptions that were virtually identical to your private research notes. Had you? Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her professional confidence beginning to erode under the weight of direct questioning. "I'd attended several of your presentations to the Orchid Society over the past few years. I'd toured your greenhouse multiple times, always with your permission and usually in the company of other researchers. Some of your ideas may have influenced my work, but that's how science advances, through the sharing of ideas and the cross-pollination of different approaches." But you didn't cite Mr. Wolfe's contributions in your paper. I didn't think formal citation was necessary for general techniques discussed in public forums. The methods I described were extensions and variations of established practices, not direct appropriations of someone else's work. Wolfe's voice carried a note of frost that could have chilled champagne. Dr. Morrison, the techniques you described in your paper on temperature gradient hybridization were developed through years of careful experimentation in my greenhouse. They involved specific combinations of heating and cooling cycles, precise timing of pollination procedures, and chemical treatments that I developed through extensive trial and error. These were not general techniques discussed in public forums. That may be your opinion, Mr. Wolfe, but it's not a matter of opinion. I have detailed records of my research, including dates, methodologies, and results. Your paper describes procedures that match my work almost exactly, down to the specific temperature ranges and timing intervals. Dr. Morrison's professional facade was beginning to crack more visibly, stress lines appearing around her eyes, as she realized the seriousness of the accusations being leveled against her. Even if that's true, even if there are similarities between your work and mine, it's hardly grounds for murder. Academic disputes are resolved through proper channels, not through violence, aren't they? A career built on stolen research, a reputation based on false achievements. How far would you go to protect that? I didn't kill Helena, if that's what you're suggesting. Where were you last night between 11 and midnight? At home in my apartment on the Upper West Side, alone, preparing lectures for today's classes and reviewing grant applications. Can anyone verify that? I live alone, Mr. Wolfe, but I was working on my computer for most of the evening. There should be time. Stamps on the files I created and modified. I'm sure the police can verify that if necessary. It was a weak alibi, the kind that could be fabricated or manipulated by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge, but it was an alibi nonetheless. After Dr. Morrison left, looking considerably less confident than when she'd arrived, I made a note to suggest that Kramer's people check her computer files and internet activity for the previous evening. 2 down, 1 to go, I said, settling back in my chair and reviewing my notes from the interviews. 2 suspects with clear motives and questionable alibis, Wolfe corrected, his tone suggesting that he was far from satisfied with the information we'd gathered. The question is which one was desperate enough to commit murder, and whether we've identified the actual killer or merely additional victims of a more complex conspiracy. Professor James Whitmore's club was one of those stately Manhattan institutions where wealthy men gathered to drink expensive whiskey and complain about the decline of civilization while surrounded by leather furniture and oil paintings of long-dead industrialists. The University Club occupied a full city block on Fifth Avenue, its imposing facade suggesting the kind of old-money respectability that came from generations of proper breeding and Ivy League educations. Whitmore met us in the oak-paneled dining room, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who had spent his entire adult life in positions of academic and social prominence. "Terrible business about Helena," he said as we settled at a corner table that provided privacy from the other diners, most of whom seemed to be engaged in similar conversations about business or politics or the various crises facing their respective institutions. She was a brilliant researcher, even if she could be somewhat difficult at times. "Difficult in what way?" Wolfe asked, accepting a menu from the waiter while maintaining his focus on Whitmore's expression and body language. "Obsessive about details, unforgiving of what she saw as lapses in professional standards, Helena had a tendency to see conspiracies where others might see simple oversights or honest mistakes. Whitmore paused to order a whiskey, an expensive, single malt that suggested he was either very wealthy or very generous with his expense account. She was the kind of person who would spend weeks verifying a single citation, checking and double-checking sources to make sure they were accurate. Such as plagiarism? Whitmore's expression didn't change, but I noticed his grip tighten slightly on his whiskey glass. Helena did raise some concerns about attribution in recent research papers, questions about whether proper credit was being given to the original developers of certain techniques, including your work. She questioned some of the techniques I'd described in my recent paper on miniature phalaenopsis cultivation, methods for inducing dwarfism in normally large species to create compact plants suitable for small space cultivation. Questioned. In what way? She seemed to think I'd borrowed ideas from other researchers without proper citation or acknowledgement. Had you? Whitmore took a careful sip of his whiskey before answering, using the pause to consider his response. Professor Wolfe, I've been working with orchids for 40 years. I've read thousands of research papers, attended hundreds of conferences, visited countless greenhouses and research facilities around the world. Ideas cross-pollinate, if you'll pardon the pun. It's sometimes difficult to remember exactly where a particular technique originated, especially when it represents a combination of methods learned from different sources over many years. But Dr. Vance believed she could trace the origins of your techniques. Helena believed many things. Not all of them were accurate, and some of them reflected a rather narrow understanding of how scientific progress actually occurs. Are you saying her research was flawed? I'm saying Helena had a tendency to see malicious intent where none existed, to interpret ordinary academic borrowing as deliberate theft. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Professor Whitmore knew exactly where his techniques had originated, and it wasn't from his own original research. His confident demeanor was a facade, carefully maintained but ultimately unconvincing to anyone who knew how to look for the signs of deception. Professor, I said, adopting a conversational tone that suggested casual interest rather than official interrogation. Where were you last night between 11 and midnight? Here, actually. The club's monthly Orchid Society meeting ran quite late. We were discussing plans for next year's flower show and reviewing applications for research grants. The conversation was particularly heated because we're facing budget cuts that will affect our ability to support graduate student research. Can anyone verify that? Certainly. At least a dozen members were present, including Dr. Richardson from the Natural History Museum and Professor Martinez from NYU. We didn't break up until well after midnight. I'd say it was closer to 12:30 when I finally left the club. It was a solid alibi, assuming it checked out. But something about Whitmore's manner suggested there was more to the story than he was telling us. His answers came too quickly, as if they'd been prepared in advance, and his body language suggested the kind of tension that comes from trying to maintain a deception under pressure. As we walked back to the house through the cool evening air, past the familiar storefronts and restaurants of our neighborhood, I found myself trying to sort through the evidence we'd gathered. 3 suspects, all with clear motives and at least superficially credible alibis, but each with reasons to want Dr. Vance silenced before she could reveal her research. "What do you think?" I asked Wolfe as we climbed the steps to our front door. "I think we're missing something important," he replied, pausing to examine the evening mail that Fritz had left on the hall table. "Something that ties these seemingly separate cases of plagiarism together into a coherent pattern. Such as? The reason Dr. Vance was in the greenhouse last night, she wasn't there to steal research, she was there to meet someone." "Meet someone? How do you know?" Because Helena Vance was a methodical person who planned everything carefully. If she wanted to photograph my research notes, she would have arranged to do it when I wasn't home, during daylight hours, when the photographs would be clearer and the risk of discovery would be minimal. She wouldn't have risked breaking in at midnight, when the security system was active and the lighting was poor. So she was meeting her killer. She was meeting someone who then became her killer, someone who knew she would be there, someone who arranged to meet her there. We spent the next morning following up on the alibis, making phone calls and checking records with the thoroughness that had made Wolfe's reputation in the detective business. It was tedious work, but necessary. Too many cases had been lost, because investigators had accepted convenient explanations without verification. Dr. Kellner's story checked out completely. His wife confirmed that he'd been at home with her and their teenage daughter the entire evening, working in his home office on a grant application that was due the following week. The daughter had even brought him coffee around 11:30, and both women remembered the time clearly because they'd been watching a late movie together in the living room. Dr. Morrison's computer files showed extensive activity throughout the evening, with documents being created and modified as late as 1:15 a.m. The timestamps were consistent with her claim that she'd been preparing lectures and reviewing applications, and there was no evidence that the files had been manipulated or backdated. Professor Whitmore's alibi was also solid. The club's doorman remembered him leaving around 12:30 a.m., and several other members of the Orchid Society confirmed that he'd been present during the entire meeting, participating actively in discussions about funding and research priorities. 3. Suspects, 3 alibis that appeared to be genuine, but one of them had to be lying or we were looking at the case from the wrong angle entirely. Maybe we're approaching this incorrectly, I suggested as we sat in Wolfe's office, reviewing our notes and trying to find a pattern that made sense. Maybe the killer isn't one of the researchers Dr. Vance was investigating. Explain. Maybe someone else knew about her investigation, someone who had a different reason for wanting her dead, or someone who was protecting the researchers she was planning to expose. Such as someone who was helping the plagiarists, someone who was facilitating the theft of research, acting as an intermediary between the people who had access to original techniques and the researchers who needed material to publish. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, considering the possibility. An intermediary of some kind, or someone with access to multiple research facilities, someone who could have been stealing ideas from various sources and selling them to researchers who needed to publish or perish. That would require someone with considerable knowledge of orchid research, someone who understood both the technical aspects of the work and the commercial and academic value of different techniques. Someone like Theodore Horstman, was Wolfe's orchid nurseryman, a quiet, methodical man who'd been tending the greenhouse for over 10 years. He was one of the few people with unlimited access to the plant rooms, and his knowledge of orchid cultivation was nearly as extensive as Wolfe's own. He traveled regularly to orchid shows and conferences, maintaining connections with researchers and growers around the world. Theodore has been with me for a decade, Wolfe said, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern at the suggestion. I trust him completely. He's dedicated, knowledgeable, and absolutely reliable. But he does have access to all your research, and he knows most of the prominent orchid researchers in the country, probably better than either of us do. I find it difficult to believe that Theodore would betray that trust. Maybe we should ask him. We found Theodore in the greenhouse, methodically watering the orchids and checking each plant for signs of disease or stress. The crime scene had been released by the police that morning, but the chalk outline where Dr. Vance's body had been found was still visible on the concrete floor, a grim reminder of the violence that had invaded this sanctuary of beauty and growth. Theodore. was a small, precise man in his 60s, with the patient manner of someone who understood that good things take time to develop. His movements were economical and efficient, reflecting decades of experience in caring for delicate plants that required constant attention but couldn't tolerate excessive handling. He looked up as we approached, his weathered face showing the strain of the past day's events. "Mr. Wolfe," he said quietly, setting down his watering can and wiping his hands on the canvas apron he always wore while working. "I'm sorry about Dr. Vance. She was a good woman, always respectful of the plants and genuinely interested in learning new techniques." "Yes, she was. Theodore, we need to ask you some questions about what happened." "Of course." "Did Dr. Vance ever express any concerns to you about other researchers plagiarizing orchid research?" Theodore's hands paused in their work, and I could see him considering the question carefully. She mentioned it once or twice over the past few months, said there were too many papers being published that described identical techniques, methodologies, that were too similar to be coincidental. Did she suspect anyone in particular? She was investigating several people, Dr. Kellner, Dr. Morrison, Professor Whitmore. She seemed to think there was some kind of organized network, people sharing information inappropriately. Did she ask you for any assistance with her investigation? She asked me to keep track of who visited the greenhouse and when to create a record of which researchers had access to which techniques and when they might have observed particular methods. Did you provide that information? I gave her a list of visitors going back 2 years, with dates and notes about what they'd been shown. She was particularly interested in people who had visited multiple times and spent extended periods examining specific types of orchids. Anyone on that list who surprised her? Theodore hesitated, glancing around the greenhouse as if checking to make sure we weren't being overheard. There was one name that seemed to upset her more than the others. Whose name? Marcus Webb. The name was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Wolfe, however, recognized it immediately. "The research coordinator for the International Orchid Society," he said grimly. "He's been here several times in the past year," Theodore continued, his voice carrying a note of concern that suggested he'd had his own doubts about Webb's motivations. "Always very interested in your hybridization work, always asking detailed questions about techniques and methodologies. He took extensive notes and photographs, said he was documenting new developments for the Society's research database." "But that's his job, isn't it?" I asked. "Research coordinators are supposed to keep track of developments in their field." "Yes," Wolfe said slowly, "but they're not supposed to share proprietary information with other researchers without permission from the original developers." "You think Webb was selling your research?" "I think Marcus Webb had access to research from dozens of facilities around the world. If he was unscrupulous enough to share that information with researchers who needed to publish, he could have orchestrated a very profitable plagiarism ring. And Dr. Vance figured it out. Dr. Vance figured it out, and Webb killed her to keep her quiet. We spent the rest of the afternoon learning everything we could about Marcus Webb. The investigation required considerable effort, involving phone calls to botanical societies, research institutions, and academic colleagues around the world. But gradually, a picture emerged of a man whose lifestyle seemed inconsistent with his official income and position. Marcus Webb was 45 years old, had a PhD in botany from Harvard, and had worked for the International Orchid Society for 8 years. His job involved visiting research facilities around the world, documenting new developments in orchid cultivation and genetics, and maintaining a comprehensive database of current research projects and techniques. It was a position that required considerable travel and extensive contacts within the botanical community. He also, according to the Society's financial records and public tax filings, earned a relatively modest salary that should have supported a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. Yet further investigation revealed that Webb lived well beyond what his official income would support. He maintained an expensive apartment on the Upper East Side, drove a luxury car, and took frequent trips to Europe and Asia that didn't appear to be related to his official duties. Either he had a very generous family trust fund, or he'd found ways to supplement his income through means that weren't reflected in the society's official records. "We need to talk to him," I said, reviewing the information we'd gathered. "We need to find him first," Wolfe replied, reaching for the telephone. It took several phone calls, but we finally tracked Webb down at his office at the Orchid Society's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. The organization occupied 3 floors of a pre-war office building near Grand Central Station, a location that was convenient for the frequent travelers who made up much of the society's membership. Webb agreed to meet with us, though he claimed he was too busy to come to the house for an interview. This presented a problem, since Wolfe rarely left the house during business hours and never to pursue an investigation unless the circumstances were truly extraordinary. "I'll have to see him at his office," Wolfe said with obvious distaste, the kind of resignation that comes from recognizing that some compromises are necessary to achieve important objectives. This was significant. Wolfe's reluctance to leave the house was legendary, and his willingness to make an exception indicated just how seriously he was taking Dr. Vance's murder. The violation of his greenhouse had affected him more deeply than he was willing to admit, and he seemed determined to find her killer, regardless of the personal inconvenience involved. The International Orchid Society occupied the top 3 floors of a distinguished pre-war building that had been converted to office space while maintaining much of its original architectural character. The lobby was elegant but understated, with marble floors and brass fixtures that suggested old-world respectability. Marcus Webb's office was on the top floor, a spacious room lined with books and journals, its walls covered with photographs of exotic orchids from around the world. The photographs were impressive, spectacular specimens from remote tropical locations, rare species that existed only in specialized collections, hybrids that represented years of careful breeding and cultivation. It was clear that Webb genuinely loved orchids and understood their beauty and complexity, which made his alleged crimes all the more disturbing. Webb himself was a smooth, polished man with the kind of practiced charm that comes from years of dealing with wealthy collectors and demanding researchers. He was tall and athletic, with graying hair and an expensive suit that suggested success and prosperity. He greeted us with apparent warmth, but I noticed his eyes were calculating, constantly assessing and evaluating our reactions and responses. "Mr. Wolfe, what an honor," he said, rising from behind his desk and extending his hand in greeting. "I've heard so much about your work with Cattleya hybrids, particularly your success with temperature-resistant varieties. The Society's members speak very highly of your contributions to orchid genetics. Mr. Webb, thank you for seeing us on such short notice." "Not at all, though I have to say I'm puzzled about why you wanted to meet. Is this about poor Helena's death?" The question was asked with what appeared to be genuine concern, but there was something in Webb's manner that suggested he already knew why we were there. His body language was too controlled, his responses too carefully modulated, like an actor delivering lines he'd rehearsed, in part. "We understand you knew Dr. Vance professionally." "Of course." Helena was one of the most respected orchid researchers in the country, possibly in the world. Her work on genetic analysis and species identification was groundbreaking. Her death is a tremendous loss to the scientific community. "When did you last see her?" "About 3 weeks ago. She came here to the office wanting to discuss some research she was conducting. She seemed quite excited about it, said she'd made some important discoveries that would be of interest to the Society's members." "What kind of research?" Webb's smile flickered slightly, like a light bulb with a loose connection. She was investigating what she called irregularities in recent orchid research publications, questions about proper attribution and citation practices. Plagiarism, you mean? Helena used stronger words than that. She seemed to think there was some kind of organized conspiracy to steal and resell research ideas, a systematic network of academic fraud that extended throughout the orchid research community. Was there? Mr. Wolfe, I coordinate research activities for orchid societies around the world. I see thousands of papers every year, visit hundreds of facilities, interact with researchers from dozens of countries. Ideas cross-pollinate naturally. It's the fundamental nature of scientific progress. Techniques are shared, modified, improved upon, and disseminated throughout the community. But some ideas require proper attribution when they're published, don't they? Absolutely. And when I see clear cases of plagiarism or improper appropriation, I report them to the appropriate authorities, journal editors, university administrators, professional organizations. Did Dr. Vance believe you had failed in that responsibility? Webb's composure slipped slightly, his practiced charm showing cracks around the edges. Helena believed many things. She had a tendency to see conspiracies where others might see simple oversight or honest mistakes in citation. Mr. Webb, I said, adopting the conversational tone that often encouraged people to reveal more than they intended, we understand you visited many research facilities in your capacity as coordinator. That's correct. It's one of the primary responsibilities of my position, to stay current with developments in orchid research and to facilitate communication between different research groups, including Mr. Wolfe's greenhouse. Several times over the past few years, Mr. Wolfe's collection is legendary among orchid enthusiasts, and his hybridization techniques are among the most advanced in the world. And during those visits, you had access to his research notes and methodologies. I observed his work, certainly. That's part of my job, to document significant developments in orchid cultivation and to make that information available to society members who might benefit from new techniques. But not to share those developments with other researchers before they're formally published, is that correct? Webb's smile disappeared entirely. I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Wolfe. I'm implying that you may have been using your position to facilitate the theft of proprietary research, that you were acting as a broker, collecting unpublished ideas from various sources and selling them to researchers who needed material to publish. That's a very serious accusation. It's a very serious crime, Wolfe added, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made it clear he wasn't making idle threats. One that Dr. Vance was preparing to expose at the International Orchid Conference next month. Helena was mistaken about many things. Was she mistaken about you? Webb stood up abruptly, moving to the window where he stared out at the busy street below. When he turned back to face us, his polished facade had cracked completely, revealing the desperation and fear beneath. You don't understand the pressure these researchers are under, he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine anguish. Publish or perish, it's not just a saying, it's reality. Young scientists struggling to establish their careers, older researchers trying to maintain their reputations and secure funding for their work. They need results, and sometimes they need help finding them. So you provided that help. I facilitated the sharing of information. I connected researchers with complementary interests, people who could benefit from each other's work. You sold stolen research. Webb walked back to his desk and slumped into his chair, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. It started small, almost accidentally. A researcher in Germany needed help with a hybridization technique that was beyond his current capabilities. I'd seen similar work done in Japan, so I put them in touch with each other. No money changed hands initially. It was just a professional courtesy, the kind of informal collaboration that happens all the time in the scientific community. But then it grew. The Japanese researcher wanted compensation for sharing his proprietary techniques. The German researcher was willing to pay for access to methods that would advance his work. I simply acted as an intermediary, facilitating the transaction, taking a commission, taking a modest fee for my services, yes. And soon you had a network of researchers buying and selling ideas through you. It wasn't like that, not exactly. It was more collaborative, researchers sharing information across international boundaries, overcoming the barriers that often prevent the rapid dissemination of new techniques. Without proper attribution, without acknowledgement, without permission from the original developers. Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Helena discovered the network about a month ago. She'd been analyzing research papers systematically, looking for patterns and similarities that might indicate improper appropriation. She was incredibly thorough, incredibly persistent. She traced techniques back to their original sources, documented the chain of transmission, compiled financial records, including techniques stolen from Mr. Wolfe's greenhouse, including those, yes. What did she plan to do with this information? She was going to expose the entire network at the International Orchid Conference in Miami. She had names, dates, financial records, correspondence, everything she needed to prove systematic fraud involving dozens of researchers from around the world. She said it was going to be the biggest scandal in botanical research history. So you killed her? Webb's head snapped up, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine shock. I didn't kill anyone. You had motive. She was going to destroy your operation and probably send you to prison for fraud and theft. You had opportunity. You knew she would be at the greenhouse last night. I wasn't at the greenhouse last night. Where were you? At home in my apartment, working late on preparations for the conference, ironically enough, reviewing presentation, proposals and coordinating with hotel staff in Miami. Can anyone verify that? I live alone, but I was on the phone with researchers in Australia and Japan for several hours. There should be phone records that can verify the times and duration of those calls. Mr. Webb, Wolfe said quietly, leaning forward in his chair. If you didn't kill Dr. Vance, who did? Webb stared at us for a long moment, then reached for his desk drawer. For a second I thought he might be going for a weapon, but instead he pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between us. Helena gave me copies of her research before she died, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She said, if anything happened to her, I should make sure the truth came out. I opened the folder and found myself looking at dozens of pages of meticulously documented evidence, research papers with highlighted similarities, correspondence between researchers, financial records showing payments for consulting services, photographs of original research notes. It was a comprehensive indictment of academic fraud spanning nearly a decade and involving researchers from around the world. This is quite thorough, Wolfe observed as he scanned the documents, his expression growing more grim with each page. Dr. Vance was nothing if not methodical in her investigation. Helena spent months putting it together, Webb said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and dread. She was like a detective, following paper trails and connecting dots that no one else had thought to look for. She had a talent for seeing patterns and relationships that others missed. Did she share this information with anyone else besides you? She was planning to present it to the conference organizing committee before making it public. She believed in following proper procedures, giving people a chance to respond to accusations before they became public. Who's on the organizing committee? Webb pulled out a sheet of letterhead and pointed to the names listed at the bottom. Dr. Morrison is the conference chair this year. Professor Whitmore handles research presentations, and coordinates the academic sessions. Dr. Kellner manages the poster sessions and graduate student presentations. I felt a chill of understanding wash over me. She was planning to present her findings to the very people she was investigating. She said it was a matter of professional courtesy and academic ethics. Give them a chance to respond before the information became public. Offer them an opportunity to make corrections or clarifications. When was this meeting supposed to take place? Tonight, actually. They were going to meet at Mr. Wolfe's greenhouse, after the evening Orchid Society meeting at the Natural History Museum. Helena said the greenhouse would provide neutral ground, and that having examples of Mr. Wolfe's work available would help illustrate some of the techniques that had been inappropriately appropriated. At the greenhouse, Wolfe's voice carried a note of alarm. Helena said it was the perfect location for the confrontation. She could demonstrate exactly how the plagiarized techniques worked, show the original research notes, and prove conclusively that the published papers contained identical methodologies. "Mr. Webb," I said carefully, "did Dr. Vance tell these people what the meeting was about?" She said she told them she'd discovered something important that would affect all of them, something that related to their research and their participation in the upcoming conference. But she didn't specify that it was about plagiarism. She wanted to see their reactions when she presented the evidence. She thought their initial responses would be revealing, that guilty parties would show signs of anxiety or defensiveness before they knew exactly what she'd discovered. I looked at Wolfe, who was wearing the expression of a man who just realized he'd been thinking about the case all wrong. "Mr. Webb," he said slowly, "I need you to make some phone calls. Contact Dr. Morrison, Professor Whitmore, and Dr. Kellner. Tell them the meeting tonight has been cancelled due to Dr. Vance's death. But do it now, and then I need you to do something else." "What?" "I need you to help us catch a killer." An hour later, we were back at the house, planning an elaborate trap that would require careful timing and considerable luck. Webb had made his phone calls as instructed, telling the 3 suspects that the group meeting was cancelled due to Dr. Vance's tragic death. But then, on Wolfe's specific instructions, he'd made 3 additional calls to each suspect individually. He'd explained that while the group meeting was cancelled, Dr. Vance had left some materials in the greenhouse that needed to be returned to their original owners, materials that contained sensitive information about their research and needed to be collected personally. Each suspect was told to come by at a different time: Morrison at 8, Kellner at 9, Whitmore at 10. "What if none of them shows up?" I asked, checking my gun and adjusting the wireless microphone that would allow me to communicate with Wolfe and Inspector Kramer from the greenhouse. "Then we know our killer isn't among the 3 researchers we've been investigating. And if more than one shows up, then we may have a more complex conspiracy than we realized, or our killer may not be coming alone." Inspector Kramer wasn't entirely happy with our plan, but he agreed to station men around the building and in the street below. If our killer showed up, we'd be ready for them. If they didn't, we'd have to reconsider our entire approach to the case. "You sure about this, Wolfe?" Kramer asked as we reviewed the final details. "Seems like we're taking a big risk, using you and Goodwin as bait." "We're not the bait, Inspector. The greenhouse is the bait. Our killer believes there's evidence hidden there that could implicate them. Evidence that Dr. Vance left behind before she was murdered. Is there?" "There is now." Wolfe had spent the afternoon carefully placing copies of Dr. Vance's research files in strategic locations throughout the greenhouse, documents that would be immediately visible to anyone searching for evidence of their involvement in the plagiarism ring. It was a calculated risk, but one that seemed likely to produce results. At 7:30, I took my position in the greenhouse, concealed behind a bank of orchid benches near the back of the room, where I could observe the entire space without being easily detected. Wolfe was in his office below, monitoring everything through the wireless intercom system we'd installed. Webb was with him, ready to provide additional context if needed, and to verify the identity of whoever showed up. The greenhouse felt different at night than it had during our previous evening visits. The artificial lighting created pools of warm, yellow light separated by deep shadows, and the tropical plants seemed to take on mysterious, almost threatening forms in the darkness. The heating system hummed continuously, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity levels that the orchids required, but the mechanical sounds seemed amplified and somehow ominous. It was easy to understand how someone could be frightened or disoriented in this environment, surrounded by thousands of exotic flowers that seemed to be watching from the shadows. The murder had changed the atmosphere of the place, transforming what had been a sanctuary into a potential battleground. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the iron stairs leading up to the greenhouse. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking around nervously as she entered the humid, artificially lit space. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing slightly among the plants. "Mr. Webb, you said you had some materials for me?" She moved into the greenhouse cautiously, staying close to the main aisle as she scanned the benches for whatever Webb had supposedly left for her. Her movements were careful and deliberate, suggesting someone who was both nervous and trying not to disturb anything that might be valuable or fragile. For 10 minutes, she searched systematically through the greenhouse, checking every bench and storage area, growing increasingly agitated as she failed to find what she was looking for. Her movements became more frantic, her breathing more rapid, as if she were running out of time for something crucially important. Finally, she stopped in the exact spot where Dr. Vance's body had been found, staring down at the chalk outline. That was still faintly visible on the concrete floor. "Where is it?" I heard her mutter to herself, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "It has to be here somewhere." But like the methodical researcher she was, she eventually accepted that her search had been unsuccessful and left the greenhouse in obvious frustration, her footsteps echoing on the iron stairs as she descended. To street level, Dr. Kellner arrived promptly at 9, looking even more nervous than Morrison had been. He called out for Webb, then began a systematic search of the greenhouse that was more thorough and professional than Morrison's had been. He checked every bench, every storage area, every place where documents might conceivably be hidden. "Where are they?" I heard him mutter repeatedly as he searched. "Helena said she had everything documented. The evidence has to be here." His search was methodical and increasingly frantic, suggesting that he knew exactly what he was looking for and understood the consequences of not finding it. But like Morrison, he found nothing and eventually left in frustration, his nervous energy undiminished by the failure of his mission. At 10 o'clock, Professor Whitmore appeared. Unlike the other two, he didn't call out or search the greenhouse immediately upon arrival. Instead, he walked directly to the spot where Dr. Vance's body had been found and stood there for several minutes, staring down at the chalk outline with an expression I couldn't quite read from my hiding place. Then he did something that made my blood freeze in my veins. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a ceramic orchid pot, one that looked identical to the murder weapon that had been collected by the police. "I know you're watching, Wolfe," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the humid air. "And I know you think you're very clever, setting this elaborate trap." He set the pot down carefully next to the chalk outline, then straightened up and looked directly at the bench where I was hiding. "You can come out now, Goodwin. We need to talk." I emerged from my hiding place with my gun drawn, but Whitmore made no threatening moves. He simply stood there, looking older and more tired than he had at his club the previous evening. "Professor," I said carefully, keeping my weapon trained on him, "why don't you explain what you're doing here?" "I'm returning the murder weapon to the scene of the crime." "You killed Dr. Vance?" No, I didn't kill Helena, but I know who did. Before I could ask what he meant, I heard footsteps on the stairs again. Someone was coming up to the greenhouse. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there according to our carefully orchestrated plan. Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway, looking surprised to see us. "Professor Whitmore, what are you doing here?" I told. "You, the meeting was cancelled, and that you should come by at 10 to collect the materials Helena left." Webb's face went pale as he realized what he'd just said. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, Marcus. Just like I think you know exactly why Helena was here last night." "Professor Whitmore," I said, trying to keep track of the rapidly developing situation, "maybe you better explain what you're talking about." "Helena wasn't killed by one of the researchers she was investigating," Whitmore said, never taking his eyes off Webb. "She was killed by the man who was running the plagiarism ring." "That's ridiculous," Webb stammered. "I told you, I was at home last night. I have phone records to prove it." "Do you, or do you have records of calls that were made by an automated system while you were actually here in the greenhouse murdering Helena?" "Why would I meet with her?" "I had no reason to. Because she'd figured out that you weren't just facilitating plagiarism. You were actively orchestrating it. You weren't just a broker, Marcus. You were the mastermind behind the entire operation." I kept my gun trained on both men, not sure which one represented the greater threat or which story was more credible. "Helena discovered that you'd been stealing research for years," Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades lecturing to skeptical students. Not just sharing information between researchers, but actually breaking into facilities, photographing documents, stealing proprietary techniques. Then you'd sell that information to researchers who needed to publish, taking a percentage of their grant money or consulting fees. You can't prove any of that. "Can't I? Helena left more evidence than just the folder she gave you, Marcus. She made copies, detailed records of every transaction, every theft, every researcher you corrupted. Where are these supposed records, hidden where you'd never think to look for them?" Webb's composure cracked completely, the polished facade disappearing like ice in summer heat. "You're lying. Helena would have told me if she'd made other copies." "Would she? Or would she have been smart enough to create insurance, knowing that someone might try to stop her from revealing the truth?" I could see Webb calculating, trying to figure out how much danger he was really in and what his options might be. The transformation was startling. The smooth, professional coordinator had been replaced by a desperate criminal who was running out of moves. "All right," he said quietly, his shoulders sagging in apparent defeat. "Maybe I did more than just facilitate the sharing of information between researchers. Maybe I did help researchers obtain techniques they couldn't develop on their own, but that doesn't mean I killed Helena." "Doesn't it? She was going to expose your entire operation, destroy your career, send you to prison. I was going to leave the country, start over somewhere else, maybe in South America or Southeast Asia, where botanical research is less regulated. But Helena wouldn't let you go quietly, would she? She wanted justice, not just your disappearance." Webb's shoulders slumped further, and for the first time since we'd met him, he looked like a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "She called me Tuesday night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said she knew everything, had documented everything, had evidence that would destroy not just me, but dozens of researchers around the world. She wanted to meet here Wednesday night to give me a chance to confess before she went public with her findings. So you came to the meeting. I came to negotiate. I thought maybe we could work something out. Maybe I could convince her to accept some kind of compromise that would protect the researchers who were really just victims of the system. But Dr. Vance wasn't interested in negotiating. She said she'd spent too much time documenting the truth to compromise with lies now. She was going to present everything at the conference, no matter what I said or did. So you killed her. I didn't mean to. The words burst out of him like water from a broken dam. We were arguing. She threatened to call the police right then and there to have me arrested on the spot. I tried to stop her, to make her listen to reason. There was a struggle. And you picked up the orchid pot and hit her with it. It was an accident. I just meant to frighten her, to make her understand how much she was going to hurt innocent people who had gotten caught up in something they didn't fully understand. Innocent people like yourself. People like Dr. Kellner, who was just trying to establish his career in a competitive field. People like Dr. Morrison, who needed one good publication to get tenure and secure her future. People like Professor Whitmore, who was facing mandatory retirement unless he could prove he was still productive and relevant. So you were helping them out of the goodness of your heart. I was helping them survive in an academic system that demands impossible things from good people. Do you have any idea what it's like to spend years on research that produces no publishable results? To watch your career disappear because you can't produce the kind of breakthrough discoveries that journals want to publish? I could see that Webb genuinely believed what he was saying, that he'd been providing a necessary service, that his victims had been willing participants rather than unwitting dupes caught up in a criminal conspiracy. Mr. Webb, I said, I think you need to come with us and explain all this to Inspector Kramer. I can't go to prison, Goodwin. I'm not built for that kind of life, and I'm too old to start over when I get out. Should have thought of that before you started stealing research. Should have thought of that before you killed Helena, Whitmore added, his voice carrying a note of moral authority that was almost judicial in its finality. Webb looked around the greenhouse desperately, as if searching for some escape route that didn't exist. The exotic plants seemed to close in around him, their alien forms creating a maze of shadows and false passages. Then, with startling suddenness, he lunged for the ceramic pot he'd brought with him. I was faster, but not by much. My shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a bench of rare Cattleya orchids. Expensive plants scattered across the floor as Webb writhed in pain, clutching his wounded arm and crying out in a voice that mixed physical agony with the deeper pain of a man whose life had just ended. Jesus Christ, Goodwin, he gasped. You didn't have to shoot me. You didn't have to grab for a weapon. It's not a weapon. It's evidence. Evidence of what? Evidence that I didn't kill Helena with that pot. This one has my fingerprints on it, but the murder weapon doesn't. I stared at him in confusion, trying to understand what he was claiming. What are you talking about? The pot that killed Helena, it wasn't one of Mr. Wolfe's orchid pots. It was one I brought with me, one I'd taken from my office collection. But when I left the greenhouse after our argument, Helena was still alive. Someone else killed her after I was gone. That's impossible. The murder weapon was one of Mr. Wolfe's pots. Was it? Did anyone actually verify that? Did anyone check the pot against Mr. Wolfe's inventory records? I looked at Professor Whitmore, who was staring at Webb with growing understanding. Marcus, he said slowly, are you saying you didn't kill Helena? I'm saying someone else was in the greenhouse that night. Someone who killed Helena after our meeting ended. Someone who used a different pot to make it look like the murder had happened during our struggle. The greenhouse fell silent except for Webb's labored breathing and the mechanical hum of the climate control system. Somewhere in the building below, I could hear Wolfe's voice calling through the intercom, asking if everything was all right. Professor Whitmore, I said carefully, how did you know to bring that orchid pot tonight? Helena told me she'd hidden evidence in the greenhouse. I thought if I returned what I believed was the real murder weapon, it might help catch her killer. But if Mr. Webb didn't kill her, how did you know what the murder weapon looked like? Whitmore went very still. his distinguished features freezing like a photograph capturing a moment of terrible realization. "I guessed," he said finally. "Did you? Or did you see it used?" But I was beginning to understand what had really happened. In the greenhouse 2 nights ago, Dr. Vance had arranged to meet with Webb to confront him about the plagiarism ring, but someone else had known about that meeting, someone who had arrived after Webb left, someone who had found Dr. Vance alone and vulnerable. "Professor," I said, my gun now trained on him instead of the wounded Webb, "you killed Dr. Vance." "That's absurd. I was at my club when she died. I have witnesses who can verify my presence there." "You were at your club until shortly before midnight. The medical examiner said Dr. Vance died between 11 and midnight. You had time to leave the club, come here, kill her, and return before anyone noticed you were gone." "Why would I kill Helena? I barely knew her outside of professional conferences." "Because you knew she was investigating you, not just for the plagiarism we've been discussing, but for something much worse." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. Helena Vance wasn't just documenting stolen research. She was documenting the systematic fabrication of an entire academic career. And the biggest fraud of all was your life's work." Whitmore's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't prove any of that." "Can't I? Or was Helena's research so thorough that she documented 40 years of plagiarism, 40 years of stolen ideas and fabricated achievements? She traced your academic fraud back to your graduate work in the 1960s, didn't she? You've been stealing research your entire career. Even if that were true, it's not grounds for murder." "Isn't it? A career built on lies, a reputation based on systematic theft. What happens when that gets exposed? You lose everything. Your professorship, your honors, your place in history, everything you've worked for, everything you've built, reduced to a footnote about academic fraud." "Helena was going to destroy you," Webb added weakly from the floor, his voice strained with pain, but carrying a note of recognition. "Just like she was going to destroy me." "So you followed her here?" "After Webb left," I continued, "the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. You found her alone in the greenhouse, probably gathering additional evidence to support her case against the plagiarism ring. Maybe she told you what she'd discovered about your career. Maybe she tried to reason with you, to convince you to voluntarily confess before she made her findings public. This is all speculation. Is it, or is it the truth? You couldn't let her expose you, couldn't let 40 years of stolen research be revealed. So you picked up that ceramic pot and killed her." Whitmore stood in silence for nearly a minute, his distinguished appearance crumbling as the weight of his crimes became impossible to bear. The greenhouse around us seemed to pulse with life, thousands of exotic flowers that had outlived the woman who died among them, beautiful organisms that continued their ancient cycles of growth and reproduction, while human beings destroyed each other over questions of credit and recognition. "She wouldn't listen," he said finally, his voice carrying the petulant tone of a child whose unreasonable demands had been refused. "Helena was so self-righteous, so convinced that her version of truth was the only one that mattered. So you killed her. I tried to reason with her first, tried to make her understand that exposing the plagiarism would hurt innocent people, students who'd been influenced by my work, colleagues who'd collaborated with me on various projects. But she wouldn't listen. She said the truth was more important than protecting people's feelings. She said science depended on honesty, and that lies, no matter how well-intentioned, always caused more harm than good in the long run. So you picked up the orchid pot and hit her. I meant to frighten her, to make her stop talking about destroying careers and ruining lives, but she just kept saying that she was going to expose everything, that nothing I could say would change her mind. And you hit her again. And again, Whitmore whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the greenhouse machinery, "until she stopped talking forever." The confession hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, poisoning the exotic beauty of the greenhouse with the ugly reality of human violence. Here, among orchids that had evolved over millions of years to create some of nature's most sophisticated and beautiful flowers, a man had destroyed a human life to protect a reputation built on lies. The greenhouse fell silent once more, broken only by Webb's labored breathing and the distant sound of sirens, Inspector Kramer and his men responding to the gunshot. Soon the plant rooms would be filled with police officers and crime scene technicians again, turning Wolfe's sanctuary into a chaos of investigation and evidence gathering for the second time in 3 days. But for now, it was just the three of us among the orchids, a wounded plagiarism broker, a confessed murderer, and me trying to understand how academic ambition had led to such violence. "Professor," I said finally, "was it worth it?" Whitmore looked around the greenhouse at the exotic flowers that had witnessed his confession, at the ceramic pot that had become a symbol of his fall from grace, at his own hands that had committed an act he'd never thought himself capable of. "No," he said quietly. "None of it was worth it." Inspector Kramer arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics who tended to Webb's gunshot wound, and detectives who began the process of formally arresting both suspects. The greenhouse quickly filled with the organized chaos of a crime scene investigation, but this time there was a sense of resolution rather than mystery. As Webb was loaded onto a stretcher and taken to the hospital under police guard, he looked up at me with eyes that reflected a mixture of physical pain and profound regret. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he said. "I just wanted to help people succeed in a system that's designed to crush them." "The road to hell," I replied, "is paved with good intentions." Professor James Whitmore was handcuffed and led away, with considerably less ceremony, his distinguished appearance incongruous with the reality of his situation. As he passed the spot where Dr. Vance had died, he paused for a moment, as if paying his respects to the woman whose dedication to truth had ultimately destroyed him. The evidence Dr. Vance had compiled was turned over to the appropriate authorities, leading to investigations at universities around the world. Her research had been even more comprehensive than we'd initially realized, documenting not just the plagiarism ring orchestrated by Webb, but systematic patterns of academic fraud that extended throughout the international botanical research community. Dozens of researchers were found to have purchased stolen techniques through Webb's network, though most claimed they'd thought they were paying for legitimate consulting services rather than participating in a criminal conspiracy. The scandal dominated botanical journals for months and led to comprehensive reforms in how research was conducted, published, and peer-reviewed. Dr. Martin Kellner and Dr. Sarah Morrison both faced academic disciplinary action for their roles in the plagiarism ring, but neither was criminally prosecuted, since they could legitimately claim they hadn't known the full extent of Webb's criminal activities. Both eventually rebuilt their careers, though their reputations never fully recovered from the scandal. Kellner left his position at the Botanical Garden and took a teaching job at a small college in Vermont, where he focused on undergraduate education rather than research publication. Morrison took early retirement from Columbia and moved to Costa Rica, where she established a small research station dedicated to studying native orchid species. The International Orchid Conference was postponed indefinitely, while the organizing committee dealt with the fallout from the revelations. The orchid research community, it turned out, was much smaller and more interconnected than anyone had realized, and much more vulnerable to the kind of systematic corruption that Webb had orchestrated over nearly a decade. Marcus Webb recovered from his gunshot wound and was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, theft of intellectual property, and accessory to murder. He served his time quietly, spending much of it working in the prison greenhouse program, teaching other inmates how to grow vegetables and maintain ornamental plants. Professor James Whitmore was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. At his sentencing hearing, he made a statement expressing remorse for Dr. Vance's death, but also defending his actions as the desperate response of a man whose life's work was about to be destroyed. Helena Vance was a good person, who believed in the importance of truth, he said. I wish I had shared her courage and integrity. Perhaps if I had been honest about my mistakes from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. As for Wolfe, he spent weeks cleaning and reorganizing his greenhouse, trying to restore the sense of peace and order that had been shattered by Dr. Vance's murder and the subsequent investigation. Many of the orchids that had been damaged during the various crime scene investigations never fully recovered, their exotic beauty diminished by exposure to the harsh realities of human greed and violence. But plants, like people, have remarkable resilience. New shoots appeared on damaged specimens, fresh flowers bloomed on plants that had seemed beyond recovery, and gradually the greenhouse returned to its status as a sanctuary of beauty and growth. Theodore worked tirelessly to nurse the wounded, orchids back to health, treating each plant with the kind of patient attention that Wolfe had always demanded. The violation of the greenhouse had affected Wolfe more deeply than he was willing to admit. For weeks after the case was closed, I would find him standing among his orchids at odd hours, as if reassuring himself that they were safe and that the sanctuary he'd created remained intact. The murder had reminded him that even the most carefully protected spaces could be invaded by the darkness of human nature. But life, as it always does, eventually returned to something resembling normal. New cases arrived, old routines resumed, and the brownstone settled back into its familiar rhythms. Only sometimes, late at night when the heating system hummed and the city slept fitfully outside our windows, I would catch Wolfe staring toward the ceiling, toward the greenhouse where beauty and death had met among the orchids. Dr. Helena Vance was buried on a grey October morning in a cemetery in Queens, surrounded by colleagues and friends who remembered her as a brilliant scientist and a person of uncompromising integrity. The funeral was well attended, with representatives from botanical societies around the world coming to pay their respects to a woman whose dedication to truth had ultimately cost her life. At the service, speaker after speaker praised Dr. Vance's contributions to botanical research and her commitment to academic integrity. But the most moving tribute came from Jennifer Liu, her graduate student, who spoke about the lessons her mentor had taught about the importance of honesty in scientific research. Dr. Vance always told us that the pursuit of knowledge was humanity's noblest endeavor, Liu said, her voice carrying despite her obvious emotion. She believed that scientists had a special responsibility to tell the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that truth might be. She died defending those principles, and that should count for something. The International Orchid Society established a research grant in Dr. Vance's name, dedicated to supporting young botanists who shared her commitment to honest scholarship and rigorous methodology. The grant program included strict ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of fraud that had led to her death. At the funeral, I overheard several conversations about the case, people trying to understand how academic competition could have led to such violence, how the pursuit of knowledge could have become corrupted by greed and ambition. She died for the truth, one elderly professor said, echoing Jennifer Liu's sentiments. In an age when truth is increasingly seen as negotiable, Helena Vance died defending the idea that facts matter, that honesty is not optional. The truth she died for has changed how we think about research integrity, another replied. Maybe that's her real legacy, not just her scientific discoveries, but her demonstration that some principles are worth defending at any cost. I hoped they were right. I hoped that Dr. Vance's death would lead to lasting reforms that would prevent future cases of academic fraud. But I also knew that as long as careers depended on publication, as long as researchers felt pressure to produce results at any cost, there would always be people willing to cut corners, to steal ideas, to compromise their integrity for professional advancement. The real tragedy wasn't just that Dr. Vance had died, but that her murder had been the inevitable result of a system that rewarded deception and punished honesty. She'd tried to expose that system, to shine light on the corruption that was eating away at scientific research like a cancer. And for that dedication to truth, she'd been killed by the very people she was trying to protect. Researchers who had lost sight of why they'd become scientists in the first place, who had allowed the pressure to publish and the desire for recognition to override their commitment to honest inquiry. In the months that followed, I found myself thinking often about the questions Dr. Vance's case had raised. How do we protect whistleblowers in a world that often punishes them for their honesty? How do we create systems that reward integrity rather than just productivity? How do we ensure that the pursuit of knowledge remains focused on truth rather than career advancement? These weren't just academic questions. They went to the heart of what it means to live in a civilized society. Dr. Vance had believed that truth was worth dying for. Webb and his co-conspirators had believed that lies were worth killing for. So in the end, both sides had paid the ultimate price for their convictions. The case also raised troubling questions about the nature of justice. Yes, the guilty had been punished and the truth had been revealed. But could we really say that justice had been served when it came too late to save Dr. Vance? Could punishment after the fact compensate for a life lost, a brilliant mind silenced, a dedicated researcher prevented from continuing her work? Even now, years after the case was closed, I find myself thinking about those orchids in Wolfe's greenhouse. Beautiful, exotic, carefully cultivated, but ultimately vulnerable to the harsh realities of a world that doesn't always appreciate beauty or truth. Like Dr. Vance herself, they represented something pure and valuable that had to be protected from those who would exploit or destroy it. But protection, I learned, isn't always enough. Sometimes the very people we trust to preserve beauty and truth are the ones who betray it. Sometimes the guardians become the destroyers, and we don't realize it until it's too late. The most haunting aspect of the case wasn't the identity of the killer or even the motive for the murder. Those questions had been answered definitively. What haunted me was the larger question of how we create a world where people like Dr. Vance can pursue truth without fearing for their lives. In the weeks following the arrests, I spent considerable time reading Dr. Vance's research on academics, fraud. Her work was exhaustive, meticulous, and deeply disturbing. She had documented not just the specific cases of plagiarism we had investigated, but a broader pattern of corruption that extended throughout the academic world. The pressure to publish, she wrote, had created a system where researchers were incentivized to produce results quickly rather than accurately. The emphasis on quantity over quality, on novelty over replication, had corrupted the fundamental principles of scientific inquiry. Young researchers faced the choice between honest work that might not lead to publication and dishonest work that would advance their careers. Webb had been both a symptom and a cause of this corruption. His network had made it easier for researchers to obtain publishable results without doing the hard work of original research. But he had also contributed to the problem by creating a market for stolen ideas, by making fraud profitable and accessible. The three researchers he had supplied with stolen techniques, Kellner, Morrison, and Whitmore, represented different points on the spectrum of academic corruption. Kellner had been young and desperate, willing to compromise his integrity for career advancement. Morrison had been established but insecure, needing validation in a competitive field. Whitmore had been successful but fraudulent, building an entire career on stolen ideas. Each had made different choices when confronted with Dr. Vance's investigation. Kellner had confessed and asked for mercy. Morrison had denied wrongdoing but offered to make corrections. Whitmore had chosen murder. What struck me most about Dr. Vance's research was her complete lack of cynicism, despite the massive fraud she had uncovered. She wrote with the passion of someone who still believed in the fundamental importance of honest scientific inquiry, who saw the corruption as a betrayal of principles rather than an inevitable aspect of human nature. "Science depends on trust," she wrote in one of her final papers. When researchers can no longer trust that published results are accurate, when students can no longer believe that their mentors are honest, when the public can no longer rely on scientific expertise, we lose something essential about what makes us human. The pursuit of knowledge becomes meaningless if that knowledge is built on lies. Reading those words, written just weeks before her death, I felt the full weight of what we had lost. Dr. Vance hadn't just been a victim of academic fraud, she had been a guardian of scientific integrity, someone willing to risk everything to protect the principles that made honest research possible. Her murder had sent shockwaves through the botanical research community and beyond. Universities implemented new oversight mechanisms for research integrity. Journals established more rigorous peer review processes. Professional organizations created whistleblower protection programs for researchers who reported academic misconduct. But I wondered if these reforms would be enough. The pressures that had led to the plagiarism ring, the need to publish, the competition for grants, the emphasis on career advancement over honest inquiry remained largely unchanged. Would future researchers faced with similar pressures make different choices than Webb, Kellner, Morrison, and Whitmore had made? The case raised profound questions about the nature of truth and its relationship to human society. Dr. Vance had believed that truth was objective, discoverable through careful research and honest reporting. Webb and his collaborators had treated truth as negotiable, something that could be manipulated or manufactured to serve their career interests. In the end, both approaches had led to tragedy. Dr. Vance's commitment to truth had cost her life. Webb's manipulation of truth had cost him his freedom and destroyed the careers of everyone associated with his network. But which approach was ultimately more valuable? Dr. Vance's research would continue to influence botanical science for decades, establishing new standards for research integrity and inspiring young scientists to pursue honest inquiry. Webb's network had produced numerous published papers, advancing careers and contributing to the accumulation of scientific knowledge, even if that knowledge was built on stolen foundations. The question wasn't just about the morality of their choices, but about the practical consequences of different approaches to truth. Did it matter if scientific knowledge was obtained through honest or dishonest means, as long as that knowledge was accurate and useful? Or was the integrity of the process as important as the quality of the results? Dr. Vance would have argued that the process was everything, that science without integrity was not science at all, but merely sophisticated propaganda. Webb would have countered that results mattered more than methods, that helping researchers advance their careers ultimately served the greater good of scientific progress. In the years that followed the case, I kept track of the various participants and their fates. Marcus Webb served his prison sentence quietly, working in the prison greenhouse and teaching other inmates about plant cultivation. Upon his release, he moved to a small town in Oregon, where he opened a nursery specializing in native plants. Far from the world of academic research and international conferences, Dr. Martin Kellner found contentment in his teaching position. at the Vermont College, working with undergraduate students who were just beginning their scientific careers. He published occasionally in teaching journals, sharing pedagogical techniques rather than original research. His students remembered him as someone who emphasized the importance of ethical conduct as much as scientific methodology. Dr. Sarah Morrison established her research station in Costa Rica and devoted her remaining years to documenting native orchid species that were threatened by habitat destruction. Her work there was genuinely original and valuable, representing the kind of honest scientific contribution she might have made throughout her career if she hadn't been pressured into compromising her integrity. Professor James Whitmore died in prison after serving 12 years of his sentence. His death was attributed to natural causes, but those who knew him said he never recovered from the shame of being exposed as a fraud. His decades of stolen research were systematically examined and discredited, erasing his contributions from the scientific record. The physical restoration of Wolfe's greenhouse took several months, but the emotional restoration took much longer. For the first year after the case was closed, Wolfe seemed unable to find the same pleasure in his orchids that had previously been the organizing principle of his life. He still maintained them meticulously, still followed his rigid schedule of daily care and observation, but the joy seemed to have gone out of the work. Theodore noticed the change and gradually took on additional responsibilities, handling much of the daily maintenance and making decisions about new acquisitions and breeding programs. He never commented directly on Wolfe's changed relationship with the greenhouse, but his increased presence served as a kind of therapy, allowing Wolfe to gradually reconnect with his passion for orchid cultivation. The breakthrough came almost exactly 1 year after Dr. Vance's murder, when one of Wolfe's experimental hybrids, a cross between Cattleya trianae and Cattleya warsuicii that he had been working on for nearly 5 years, finally bloomed. The flower was spectacular, with deep purple petals and a golden yellow lip that seemed to glow in the greenhouse lighting. I found Wolfe standing before the plant at 6 in the morning, still in his pajamas, staring at the bloom with an expression I hadn't seen since before the murder. There were tears in his eyes, tears of joy, relief, and perhaps grief for the woman who would have appreciated the beauty and significance of what he had accomplished. She would have loved to see this, he said quietly, speaking to the flower, as much as to me. Helena always understood that creating something beautiful was its own form of truth-telling. From that moment, the greenhouse began to feel like a sanctuary again rather than a crime scene. Wolfe resumed his regular schedule of plant care and observation, began planning new hybridization projects, and even started entertaining visitors again. The murder would always be part of the greenhouse's history, but it would no longer define its present or future. Over the following years, Wolfe and I worked dozens of other cases, murders and disappearances, fraud and blackmail, the full spectrum of human criminality that seemed to find its way to our brownstone on West 35th Street. But the Vance case remained special, both for its personal impact on Wolfe and for the larger questions it had raised about truth and integrity in human society. The case influenced how we approached subsequent investigations, making us more sensitive to the complex motivations that could drive people to crime. We learned to look beyond simple explanations of greed or passion to understand the systemic pressures and institutional failures that could corrupt even well-intentioned people. We also became more aware of our responsibility as seekers of truth. Dr. Vance's murder had reminded us that truth-telling could be dangerous, that exposing corruption often came at personal cost. But it had also demonstrated that the alternative, allowing lies and fraud to flourish unchallenged, was ultimately more destructive to society as a whole. In one case involving academic misconduct at a local university, we insisted that our client implement whistleblower protections before we would reveal the identity of researchers involved in data fabrication. In another case involving corporate fraud, We refused payment until we were assured that the information we had uncovered would be shared with appropriate regulatory authorities. These decisions sometimes cost us clients and fees, but they reflected the lesson Dr. Vance had taught us about the importance of principle over profit. Truth-seeking wasn't just a profession for us, it was a moral obligation that came with responsibilities as well as rewards. The International Orchid Conference that Dr. Vance had planned to use as her platform for exposing academic fraud was eventually held 3 years later in a smaller venue with a much more subdued atmosphere. The organizers dedicated the conference to Dr. Vance's memory and established new ethical guidelines for research presentations. I attended the conference at Wolfe's request, partly to represent him at the memorial service for Dr. Vance and partly to observe how the orchid research community had changed in the wake of the scandal. The changes were subtle but significant. More emphasis on collaborative research, greater transparency in methodology, more careful attention to proper attribution and citation. During the memorial service, speaker after speaker praised Dr. Vance's contributions to botanical research and her courage in exposing academic corruption. But the most moving tribute came from a young graduate student who had never met Dr. Vance, but had been inspired by her example to pursue her own research with uncompromising integrity. Dr. Vance showed us that being a scientist means more than just discovering new facts, the student said. It means having the courage to defend the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or dangerous. She died for principles that might seem abstract or academic, but those principles are what make honest scientific inquiry possible. The student's words reminded me of something Dr. Vance had written in one of her final papers. The pursuit of knowledge is ultimately a moral endeavor. We seek truth not just because it is useful, but because truth-seeking is what makes us fully human. When we abandon that pursuit, when we compromise our integrity for convenience or profit, we lose something essential about what it means to be civilized beings. As I flew back to New York after the conference, I found myself thinking about the different forms of justice that had emerged from the Vance case. There had been legal justice, the arrest and conviction of those responsible for her death, and the fraud that had led to it. There had been professional justice, the reforms in research practices and the new protections for whistleblowers. There had even been a kind of poetic justice, the exposure of decades of fraud that had been hidden behind facades of respectability and academic achievement. But had there been true justice? Could any punishment or reform truly compensate for the loss of Dr. Vance's life and the contributions she might have made to botanical science? Could the prevention of future fraud justify the cost of exposing the current corruption? These questions had no easy answers, but they seemed important to ask. Dr. Vance had died believing that truth was worth any sacrifice, that exposing lies was more important than protecting the people who told them. Her killers had died believing that protecting their reputations was worth any crime, that maintaining their positions was more important than honoring their obligations to honest inquiry. In the end, both sides had paid the ultimate price for their convictions. Dr. Vance had sacrificed her life for her principles. Webb and Whitmore had sacrificed their freedom and reputations for their crimes. The question was whether the rest of us had learned anything from their sacrifices, whether their tragedy would inspire us to build a better world or simply serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncompromising commitment to principle. Even now, years after the case was closed and all the participants had either died or moved on to new lives, one mystery remains. What would have happened if Dr. Vance had chosen a different path? What if she had decided to approach the researchers privately rather than exposing them publicly? What if she had been willing to accept partial corrections rather than demanding complete honesty? What if she had chosen discretion over principle? Would she still be alive today, continuing her research and training new generations of botanists? Would the orchid research community have found ways to reform itself quietly, without the trauma and publicity that had accompanied her murder? Would the cause of scientific integrity have been better served by compromise and gradual change rather than confrontation and dramatic exposure? These questions are unanswerable, but they haunt me nonetheless. Dr. Vance made a choice to pursue truth regardless of the consequences, and that choice led directly to her death. But it also led to reforms that might prevent future researchers from facing the pressures and temptations that had corrupted Webb's network. Her sacrifice had meaning and impact, but it remained a sacrifice nonetheless. The real mystery isn't who killed Dr. Helena Vance or why. Those questions were answered definitively. The real mystery is how we honor her memory and carry forward her legacy. How do we create a world where truth-telling is rewarded rather than punished, where integrity is valued more highly than productivity, where people like Dr. Vance can pursue honest inquiry without fearing for their safety? These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves in our own lives and professions. We can't bring Dr. Vance back, but we can try to build the kind of world she died trying to create, a world where truth matters more than convenience, where principles are worth defending, and where the pursuit of knowledge remains a fundamentally moral endeavor. The orchids in Wolfe's greenhouse continue to bloom and reproduce, following the ancient cycles that have sustained their species. For millions of years, they have outlived Dr. Helena Vance, Marcus Webb, and Professor James Whitmore. They will outlive all of us, carrying forward the genetic heritage that connects them to their wild ancestors, while adapting to the artificial environment that Wolfe and Theodore have created for them. In their persistence and beauty, they serve as a reminder that some things endure beyond human ambition and corruption. The pursuit of knowledge, the appreciation of beauty, the commitment to truth, these impulses have sustained human civilization through countless scandals and tragedies. They will continue to inspire future generations of researchers, artists, and truth seekers, even as new forms of corruption and new challenges to integrity emerge. Dr. Vance's murder was a tragedy, but it was not the end of the story. The reforms her death inspired, the researchers her example encouraged, the students her sacrifice motivated, these represent her true legacy, the continuing impact of a life dedicated to honest inquiry and uncompromising principle. The case file on Dr. Helena Vance's murder has been closed for years, but the larger case she was pursuing, the defense of truth in a world too often willing to settle for comfortable lies, remains open. It's a case that requires all of us to serve as both investigators and witnesses, seeking truth wherever it leads us and defending it against those who would compromise or corrupt it. In the end, that may be the most important lesson from the corpse in the conservatory, that the pursuit of truth is never finished, that the defense of integrity is never complete, and that each of us has a role to play in preserving the principles that make honest inquiry possible. Dr. Vance died for those principles, but her death will be meaningful only if we continue to live for them. The orchids in Wolfe's greenhouse bloom on, beautiful and enduring, testaments to the power of patient cultivation and careful attention. Like the pursuit of truth itself, they require constant tending, protection from corruption, and commitment to long-term goals that extend beyond immediate gratification. They remind us that some things are worth preserving regardless of the cost, that beauty and truth are their own justification, and that the most important victories are often achieved one small step at a time. And so, the story continues. In laboratories and libraries, in classrooms and conferences, wherever people gather to seek knowledge and share what they have learned. Dr. Helena Vance is gone, but her commitment to truth lives on in every researcher who chooses honesty over Convenience, in every teacher who emphasizes integrity over productivity, in every student who asks difficult questions and refuses to accept easy answers. The corpse in the conservatory has been buried, the killers have been punished, and justice has been served. But the larger mystery, how to build a world where truth-telling is safe and integrity is rewarded, remains unsolved. It's a mystery that requires all of us to be detectives, gathering evidence and testing theories, following leads wherever they might take us. That investigation continues today. In countless small acts of honesty and integrity, in the daily choices we make between truth and convenience, between principle and profit, Dr. Vance showed us what those choices might cost, but she also showed us why they're worth making. The orchids bloom on, beautiful and eternal, witnesses to human folly and human nobility alike. They have no voice with which to tell their stories, but they endure nonetheless, carrying forward the genetic information that connects them to countless previous generations while adapting to meet the challenges of an ever-changing world. Like the pursuit of truth itself, they represent both continuity and change, both preservation and progress. They remind us that some things are worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth dying for, and that the most important battles are often fought not on dramatic stages, but in quiet moments when no one is watching, and the only witness is our own conscience. Dr. Helena Vance understood this. She died defending principles that might have seemed abstract or academic to casual observers, but which she knew were essential to the survival of everything she valued most. Her legacy lives on, not just in the reforms her death inspired, but in the example she set for all of us, who seek truth in a world too often content with lies. The mystery of her murder has been solved, but the mystery of how to honor her memory remains open. Each of us must decide how to answer that challenge, how to carry forward her commitment to integrity and truth. The orchids in Wolfe's greenhouse offer one model: patient, persistent, beautiful, enduring. Perhaps that's enough to guide us as we continue the investigation she began, seeking truth wherever it leads us, and defending it against all who would corrupt or destroy it. The case is closed, but the story continues. The corpse in the conservatory is gone, but the conservatory itself remains, a sanctuary of beauty and truth in a world that desperately needs both. That may be the most fitting memorial to Dr. Helena Vance, not a monument of stone or metal, but a living testament to the principles she died defending, blooming eternal in the greenhouse where her body was found, but her spirit endures.